Catherin Parr and Thomas Seymour had become acquainted before her marriage to Henry VIII. She had fallen for him. He was dark, handsome, charismatic, ambitious, and sexual. The relationship was not to be then. Instead, Catherin caught the eye of Henry VIII and became his sixth and final wife. However, Catherine's feelings for Thomas would endure. When Henry VIII finally died, within weeks, Catherin had become Thomas Seymour's mistress. And 6 months after Seymour had persistently pressed her to get married, they were wed. Thomas Seymour was the brother of Jane Seymour, the third wife of Henry VIII, the wife who had given Henry his precious son and heir, and had died shortly after giving birth. He was also the uncle to the new boy king, Edward VI. Thomas Seymour's situation had risen significantly since the death of Henry VIII. He had become a member of the Privy Council and had been given the title Baron of Sudeley, giving him possession of Sudeley Castle. Catherin and Thomas Seymour were married in secret, without the consent or knowledge of the king. The king, who she had been a mother figure to, and this act could have been considered treason. As soon as the marriage was announced publicly, murmurs in court began immediately. Slander was so rampant about Catherin that Thomas tried to get an act of parliament that men should not have liberty to speak against the queen. In the winter of 1547, Catherin became pregnant when she was just shy of 36 years old. Catherin suffered horribly with morning sickness, and in the early stages of her pregnancy, Thomas Seymour began a series of extremely overfamiliar, inappropriate behavior with the Princess Elizabeth, who was living in their home. The rumors about Elizabeth and Seymour were widespread, so much so that Catherin ended up sending Elizabeth away, and she, along with Seymour and their other ward, Lady Jane Grey, went to Sudeley Castle for the remainder of her pregnancy. Catherin would never see Elizabeth again. A series of works were done to the castle to prepare for the new baby. The nursery was done up in a crimson velvet and taffeta. On the 30th of August, 1548, Catherin gave birth to a baby girl, whom she named Mary, after Henry VIII's eldest daughter and Catherine's stepdaughter. 6 days later, Catherin would pass away from what was then known as childbed fever. Before she died, Catherin dictated a will orally and left all of her possessions to her husband. She died between 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning on September 5th, 1548. After her death, Catherine's body was prepared, wrapped in a wax cloth, and placed in a coffin lined with lead. Her body stayed in her privy chamber until it was time for the funeral. The chapel at Sudeley was then draped with black cloth. Lady Jane Grey was Catherine's chief mourner. Her funeral was the first ever royal Protestant funeral held in English. Catherin was finally buried on the north side of the altar of the chapel on Sudeley Castle's grounds. Seymour left Sudeley Castle immediately after Catherine's passing. In her 36 years, Catherin had been married to 4 men. She had become Queen of England. She had served as regent when Henry VIII was fighting in France, and she was the first woman to publish her own writing with her own name on it in England. Thomas Seymour would quickly go on to pursue the Princess Elizabeth, aiming to marry her. He was ultimately arrested and executed for treason 6.5 months after Catherine's death. What became of Thomas Seymour and Catherin Parr's daughter is unknown, as her records stop around the age of 2.